Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. George Mason University is one of the great educational institutions in our area, but have you ever wondered how it got to be that way? Well, our guest today is Mr. Bob Vey from the library at George Mason University, and he is an expert on the history of George Mason. So Bob, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Chuck. Thank you very much.
So maybe you can set the stage for us. So where is Mason today before we get into how it got there?
Okay, well, George Mason is the largest research university in the Commonwealth of Virginia. George Mason enrolls about 36,000 students, and we have about 7,500 faculty and staff. We have 4 campuses, 3 of them in Northern Virginia and 1 in Korea. George Mason University has been recognized by the Carnegie Foundation as a Research One university, meaning we do a high level of research, whether it's medical research, whether it's hard science research, all kinds of research. We're funded, we receive a lot of grants, we graduate many students at the doctoral level. There are only 115 R1 universities in the United States, so we're one of just a few.
Mm-hmm. So, when did George Mason University get its start?
Well, it depends on what you consider George Mason University, but initially, after World War II, the big 3 universities in the state of Virginia, that would be University of Virginia, Virginia Polytechnic Institute, which is Virginia Tech, and William and Mary began sort of a competition to establish branches and extension centers across the Commonwealth of Virginia. University of Virginia in 1949 was looking to plant a flag in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia did not have an institution of higher learning but for Marymount University, which is in Arlington, a very small women-only school. So the president of the University of Virginia, his name is Colgate W. Darden Jr. He was also the governor of Virginia just before World War II. He calls a friend of his in Arlington, and this gentleman is named C. Harrison Mann Jr. C. Harrison Mann Jr. is an alum from the University of Virginia Law School, and he is a practicing lawyer in Arlington. He's also the head of the Washington Area Alumni Association for the University of Virginia. So he calls him up on the phone, and he says, and he went by Hank, so he said, "Hank, the people in Northern Virginia need higher ed, but they don't know it yet. Would you help me establish a center in Northern Virginia?" And C. Harrison Mann agrees, and he gets put on a committee with a dozen other Northern Virginians who were leaders, business leaders, education people, people from the PTA, etc. And the first step they take is to create an extension center of the University of Virginia. So in 1950, they opened the Northern Virginia University Center, which is literally an extension center. Adult ed, catching up with your certifications, things like that. And it operates out of the Washington Lee High School. Okay, it is famously successful, and they run it for several years, and folks around the area in Northern Virginia see that this is operating really well, and now they want something for their kids to go. And the folks who are on this committee that Mann heads are thinking the same thing. How can we turn this into an actual college? So they talked to the university about it, And the university is certainly amenable to it. C. Harrison Mann, around 1954, well, in 1954, is elected to the House of Delegates. So now they have a man inside. And C. Harrison Mann starts pushing, starts showing that they need higher ed in Northern Virginia. And he starts thinking of ways that we could introduce this. UVA is definitely on their side, and UVA is ready to support this with money and faculty and what have you. So they put through a bill through both the House and the Senate, and they both pass in 1956. And they write a resolution that says, well, George, the University of Virginia has state approval to create a branch in Northern Virginia. It's to be a 2-year branch, nothing less but nothing more. So they never intended to have dormitories. It never intended to be very large. It actually said in the write-up, educational buildings only. So it's passed, and they slate to open in 1957. Since they don't have land, and the rule in the state, Commonwealth of Virginia is that if you supply the land, the state will put the building on if it's approved. So they don't have land yet. They have to go looking for land. But to start out, they rent an abandoned elementary school in Bailey's Crossroads called Bailey's Elementary School. It's an old 8-room 1920s era elementary school. The school left in 1954 to get a new modern school, and there it was just hanging out there. So they opened it in the fall of 1957. They call it George Mason College. I'm sorry, they call it University College of the University of Virginia. They'll call it George Mason a couple of years later. And it opens that fall with a total of 17 students. Now, faculty and administration from the University Center over at Washington Lee moonlight as the faculty for the new branch college. It will be there for 7 years. It takes that long to discover where they're going to build the permanent branch.
So they were in these temporary facilities for 7 years, and then what happened?
Well, they eventually build the permanent campus at Fairfax. It's 1 mile south.
So who gave the land?
Okay, well that's the interesting story.
Okay.
There's kind of a fight over where they're going to build it. The Board of Visitors wants to build out in the western part of Fairfax County, over actually near Loudoun County, okay, right where Reston is now. But the Northern Virginians, led by C. Harrison Mann and this group of advisors, want to build it right in the center because they want a place where it's easy for students to get to. And they don't want students to drive out there.
Oh, yeah.
Because in the 1950s, it was worse getting out there than it is today.
Hard to believe.
So it's almost comes to a head where they almost cancel the whole deal because neither wanted one side. One side, the BOV liked the western part primarily because it was free land. Okay, the Fairfax people wanted the spot in the center of Fairfax County because it was centrally located and that people could get to it very easily. And that plot of land is the Ravensworth Farm, which is now the Ravensworth Shopping Center. So it gives you an idea of where it is.
All right.
So it gets to a head, and around end of 1957, beginning of 1958, that we're not going to be able to choose land here because we both want two different things. And that's where the mayor of Fairfax, town of Fairfax at that point, his name was John C. Wood, steps in and says, he calls his town council together on a very rare Sunday afternoon meeting and says, look, this thing is going to collapse. Let's buy some land in Fairfax and let's offer it for free to the University of Virginia. That'll bring the college here to Fairfax. They unanimously agree. They know the land they're looking for. It's just a mile south of town, and it's owned by a friend of John Wood, former state's attorney. And they offer him $300,000. They raise a bond in the town. They offer him $300,000, and he agrees. They purchase the land, and then they offer it to University of Virginia for $10, which is essentially the sum of entering the deed in the deed book. UVA loves that idea, and they accept. So that's how we get that land. Now, it's 150 acres. If you look at George Mason today, it's 578 acres.
Wow.
So they had to purchase the pieces of land later to make sure that the development didn't come in and take all of the rest of the land.
Okay, so the land is given to the University of Virginia. So how does Mason become its own independent entity?
Sure. George Mason starts in 1964 at the campus in Fairfax. They start with 356 students, sophomores and freshmen. It begins to really grow because now they have a real facility. They have a permanent home, and the morale is very, very high. It's a good location, and each year the enrollment just starts to increase. It got to the point where the University of Virginia, I think, was ready to let us go. They didn't want George Mason to fail if they were to let go so quickly. So George Mason had to go through and it had to establish, by then it was called George Mason College. Okay, it was renamed in 1960. So George Mason College began to establish all of its own procedures. Actually got its own accreditation before it was separate from the University of Virginia. Academic plan, facilities, master plan, et cetera. They put all those things together in the late 1960s, knowing that the University of Virginia was eventually going to divest itself of George Mason.
And so how did the name George Mason get chosen?
That is a great question. Okay, we have no records. We have no documentation. My guess is the documentation's at the University of Virginia.
Oh, okay.
The only thing I can guess is that all the other local patriots' names were taken. You know, somebody had Jefferson; he belonged to UVA. Lee, Washington. They were all taken. But George Mason was from Fairfax, though that was the eastern end of Fairfax, and he was a significant, though almost forgotten, patriot.
So the first graduating class was, what, 1968, is that right?
68 was the first four-year graduating class. Because,
and how many?
52.
52, wow.
George Mason was a two-year college, but it changed to a four-year college in 1966.
And how many people graduated last year?
Well, let's see. Summer, or rather spring or winter. About 8,000 to 9,000 people graduate from George Mason in a year.
So, you know, every institution has its traditions. And so what are some of Mason's traditions and the history of some of those?
Okay, well, George Mason, many of George Mason's traditions were formed during the tenure of the first graduating class. The green and gold, okay, there's a lot of people, there are some legends about how green and gold came about. That some coach of the baseball team thought green and gold looked good on a baseball uniform. That's one. 2 rooms in George Mason's home there in eastern Fairfax. One is green, one is gold, that at Gunston Hall. A quirky one is that the chancellor's assistant was setting up Christmas decorations in his office, and they chose green and gold. He liked it and said, these are our colors. And then even more quirky one is that George Mason is believed to have had gangrene, which causes your toes to turn green and gold, green and yellow. But actually, the real answer is they held a poll in early 1965. It's not very well reported, but it is in the student newspaper, and the students chose green and gold.
Okay, well, good. I'm glad it wasn't the gangrene one.
Yeah, and then other traditions, Mason Day. Mason Day is our spring festival. It evolved from UVA, where they had Founders Day, which was Jefferson's birthday, in April. They celebrated at George Mason until about 1967. George Mason would celebrate Mason Day after Founders Day, the day after. So it went from a half day of service awards and academic awards to a festival with live bands and picnics and barbecues and field day type games.
Now, I know it may not be an official tradition, but there's always the painting of the iconic statue of George Mason.
Oh yeah, the dressing up of the statue. Right, people put people dress him in T-shirts. People put hats on him. People wrap him up in ribbons and things like that. There's also Patriots Day, which is our fall festival. Same type of thing. It celebrates the end of the term, and there are bands and all kinds of fun things. International Day, International Week, again, we celebrate kind of George Mason's diversity. And we have a lot of international students. We have students from 130 plus countries at George Mason. So those are some of the main traditions.
Now, as a major research university, you obviously have some really high caliber talent. Who are some of the personalities who've helped shape the university and, you know, the whole culture and ethos of the university?
Well, you have to go back, I think you have to start, I had mentioned C. Harrison Mann, very important. He's kind of the father of the university. Then you have John Wood, the mayor of Fairfax, who really kind of helped us along all the way through. Even after he got the land for us, he served on advisory boards at George Mason. He was sort of the unofficial marshal at graduation. He was a fixture at George Mason. He was the first rector of the Board of Visitors when we became independent in 1972. And he and his wife donated set up an endowment for a scholarship, which still exists today. Then you have John Till Hazel, who is a lawyer and real estate developer, one of the original developers of Tyson's Corner. He helped us acquire the 421 additional acres of land during the 1960s. He was also rector of the Board of Visitors. He also helped us get the law school, and he continues to devote a lot of his time, expertise, and capital to the university.
Now, Mason made the Fabulous Four, and you know there's a whole history revolving around sports. Maybe you could share some of that with us.
Wow, well, it really started out small. If you look at the Final Four in 2006, the world's attention was on George Mason. And as a matter of fact, on April 1st, 2006, George Mason University was the #1 Googled term because people still couldn't figure out who we were. But our athletics really started kind of slow. We were an intramural athletic school for the first, until about 1965. Our basketball team started out in 65. We were called the George Mason College Chargers. Then we were called the Marauders. We didn't have the Patriot nickname until about 1967 or 68. It played local teams. We didn't really play an intercollegiate game until late 60s. Baseball team started in 1966. Again, played a lot of local club teams and then eventually became an intercollegiate team. But the one team that actually was our first true intercollegiate sport was rugby. we had a rugby team, and we were playing UMD and University of Virginia and Randolph-Macon and some other local universities. And rugby was very popular. It was an intercollegiate sport here, and then it's kind of evolved into or devolved into a club sport.
Now, obviously, each of the departments has its own history, and I know you have some Nobel laureates from Mason. And we had been talking before the show about the English department becoming the steward for an important theater project.
Oh yeah, the Federal Theater Project collection really put George Mason on the national map for the first time. We had just become independent from from University of Virginia, and we had a faculty member in English. Her name was Lorraine Brown. She taught English through theater, and she knew about the Federal Theater Project, which was a WPA program that put people to work in theater.
That was during the Depression.
During the Depression. The records, after it closed down shop, were missing for a long time. Not missing, but no one knew where they were, and Dr. Brown wanted to gain access to the records so that she could use them to teach. After a very long search, she found them in an abandoned GSA warehouse in Baltimore. And we made a deal with the Library of Congress, who was the custodian of the records, and for us to bring the records in, take care of them, and then make them available to researchers, which we did. And it made national news. And we became the hub of research for this.
Well, there were a lot of big-name writers and actors who were part of this, and I guess this was all being lost.
At that time, it was. But you had, plays by Richard Wright. You had Will Geer, who later was in the Waltons, but he was a young actor in the Federal Theater Project. Arlene Francis. There were a number of other. Burt Lancaster was in the Federal Theater Project. So you had a number of people who got their start in the Federal Theater Project, and heck, no one would know. Unless, until the records were recovered.
Exactly. Now, what are some of your favorite anecdotes about Mason and the people at Mason?
Yeah, one of my favorite is that George Mason College had just completed building in August of 1964 in Fairfax. So they had to move everything out of Bailey's Crossroads. And so they hired a local moving company, Craig Van Lines, which is still around. And they came up and literally moved the entire college with 3 moving vans in one day. So they loaded everything up, and this is scientific equipment, this is office furniture, et cetera, and trucked it down to Fairfax, in about half an hour, and they said, well, that's it. And we actually have that on video.
That's funny.
Another really interesting one is we did an oral history with a faculty member who worked during the George Johnson era. When George Johnson was president. George Johnson came to work very, very early. So he told me that anytime he wanted to talk to George Johnson, he was very busy too, you had to catch him early. So he told us that he used to hide in the bushes and wait till George Johnson parked his car, then he would ambush him and ask him the question that he wanted. There's another story about, and again, I heard this in an oral history, about when Chancellor Thompson in the late 60s was asked by the local morgue here in Fairfax if we wanted a human cadaver. This was an unidentified person, and they thought we're a university, we would probably have some medical research. And he was talked into taking the cadaver back to the university in his own car. So he had a 67 Ford Thunderbird, big car. So apparently they put the cadaver in the back of the car, and they drove it back to Fairfax. Now, I don't recall how that ended, but that's kind of an interesting.
It's like Weekend at Bernie's.
Almost, almost.
Well, Bob, we want to thank you for joining us and sharing the history of George Mason University. And it's a little gift to our book, Civil War Graves of Northern Virginia.
Oh, how kind of you.
And we'll look forward to seeing more progress at Mason, and who knows, it's come a long way in a very short period of time, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more to come in the years to come. We want to thank you for tuning in to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Please visit our website at www.timetravel21.com, and we'd love to hear from you. So please write us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. Keep watching, keep learning about history, and I'll see you next time.